This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Look around. You can find cars like these on AutoTrader, like that car riding your tail. Or if you're tailgating right now, all those cars doubling as kitchens and living rooms are on AutoTrader too. Are you working out and listening to this ad at the same time? Well, multitasking pro, cars like the ones in the gym parking lot are for sale on AutoTrader. New cars, used cars, electric cars, maybe even flying cars. Okay, no flying cars, but as soon as they get invented, they'll be on AutoTrader. Just you wait. AutoTrader.
Welcome to the Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today I have got a returning guest, Ian Buckley. Ian, how you doing today?
Well, thanks for having me back.
Well, thanks for coming back. Glad to have you on. Glad to have you back to talk about this today. So today, we've already talked a little bit about you in the past, but just to remind people who you are and what you do, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Yes. So as you said, my name is Ian Buckley. I have been with the network, now the Film Stories Network, for a couple of years, co-hosting We Are Starfleet, a Star Trek discussion podcast, Illumination Above All, a conversation podcast about the Apple TV Plus show Severance. And I did have a Star Wars podcast as well for a little while, which has since been abandoned. And yeah, I pop up on Movieversaries constantly, Real Talk, basically any of the movie discussion podcasts, such as this one, you'll hear me as a semi-frequent guest.
Okay, great. Very cool. Now, today we are talking about Cowboy Bebop, which the movie, and this had different titles depending on the release date and so the original title in Japanese, Cowboy Bebop, it's just the same thing, just in katakana. Tengoku no Tobira, which literally translates to Heaven's Door. This was translated in originally as Knockin' on Heaven's Door, but they decided to take that off the original release and just call it Cowboy Bebop the movie because they were worried about probably trademark or copyright infringement with the Bob Dylan song. And even though the title literally translates to Heaven's Door, I'm not sure 100%, but I believe it was intended to reference the Bob Dylan song originally, even in the Japanese title, because most of the titles in the TV show also referenced different songs that were like influences. So then later on, when it was re-released in 2018, it had the proper subtitle, Knockin' on Heaven's Door. And even though it came out after the series, so this came out in 2001, and the series ended in 1999, anyone who, spoiler alert for a TV show that's over 20 years old, but at the end of the series, it looks like Spike dies. Whereas in this one, and the crew is basically fractured at the end of that series. But in this one, they're all together, they're running on a typical mission, and this is actually set between episodes 22 and 23 of the original series. Before we jump too much into the movie, what is your history with Cowboy Bebop, Ian?
So like many kids of the 90s and early 2000s, Cowboy Bebop hit me and my friend group like a ton of bricks. Here in the States, it was, kind of a late night Cartoon Network mainstay for many years. And then as soon as, like the early days of online video streaming and then DVD, when it finally got released on DVD, it was heavy in the rotation for a while. It was one of those shows that I found myself frequently introducing other people to. I'm sure a lot of people know that experience when you're, especially at that age, you're excited about this like new anime series and like half your friends have never even heard the word anime before, and you're like, just watch this. It's cool as shit. You'll lose your mind. So I've probably seen the first few episodes of the series many, many more times than the last few episodes, just because I've had that, sit down, you got to watch this and check it out experience so many times over the years. I probably saw the movie for the first time. I mean, definitely after I finished the series, it was sort of like, hey, did you know there's also a movie where you get basically an extra 90-minute adventure with all these characters you've sadly had to say goodbye to? And so, the movie just kind of made it into the rotation whenever I'd rewatched the series, but it had probably been about 10 years since I saw either one. And then this was playing at my local theater a few months back, and I got to see it again. So that was great. It was really nice to revisit it.
Very cool. Yeah, so I actually came to Cowboy Bebop late because, like you said, it was on Cartoon Network. But when I was in high school, my family did not have cable TV, and I was in high school in the late '90s, early 2000s. I graduated in 2002. So, and by the time my family did get cable when I was in university, it had they basically stopped airing it on Cartoon Network. That was by the time when it had, completely gone off the network. So I didn't come to Cowboy Bebop until the DVDs came out, and then I just purchased the whole set because I'd been hearing about it from all my friends for years and hadn't been able to watch it. So, but actually, my first introduction to Cowboy Bebop, the first thing I saw was the movie. I had found the movie at on sale at Blockbuster, and just because I had heard about the series a lot, I'm like, okay, well, let me check out the movie. And one of the things I loved about the movie is that it was the perfect introduction to it if you had not seen the series. Like if you had seen the series, yeah, there's a lot of stuff you're going to pick up on, but if you hadn't, it's it gives you everything you need to know. It is a textbook example of how to introduce these characters and this concept in a very short amount of time, and then from that point on, it just hits the ground running and it just doesn't stop for the entire 115 runtime. One of the interesting things, though, about Cowboy Bebop is it is so popular in America. I think if you talk to a lot of people from our generation, or maybe even people a little bit older, they will tell you, and you ask them what their favorite anime is, 9 times out of 10, I think they're going to say Cowboy Bebop. It was such a massive hit in the US. The funny thing is, it is almost unheard of in Japan. Because every time people ask me, what's your favorite anime? I always say Cowboy Bebop. And they look at me like I've just said the most obscure title you'd imagine. They're just like, what is that? I've never heard of that before. And I try to say it again in the Japanese katakana pronunciation, Cowboy Bebop, and they still just have no idea. So then I look it up on my phone. I'm like, and they had never nothing, completely ignorant of it. They'd
Hmm.
never seen it at all, which shocks me because it's amazing how something can be so amazingly popular in America, whereas in its home country, it's no one even knows them. It's kind of like the David Hasselhoff phenomenon in Germany, I guess.
Yeah, I'm curious. Was the follow-up series Samurai Champloo, was that like any more popular in Japan than Cowboy Bebop? Because that was pretty popular here too. Not as popular, but I mean, I was a big fan of that too.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually. That's a good question. I've never really looked too much into it. I think maybe some people are more likely to have heard about it as opposed to Cowboy Bebop. It is I think it ticks a little bit more of the anime boxes that most people expect in Japan. It's a more tied into Japanese culture and all that, whereas Cowboy Bebop is something very unique among anime shows, I think. There's nothing really like it I can think of. Of course, I'm not much of an anime fan to begin with, so that's not I'm not may not be the best judge of it, but excuse me. But my understanding is that I'm not sure if it's very popular, but I think it is a little more well known.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, again, not an enormous anime fan, but for me, it was the that intro anime, like if Dragon Ball Z and Gundam weren't your thing growing up, like that was basically it. Like when I heard anime, I was like, my brother was more into it and he was a little bit younger than me and he was huge into Dragon Ball. He was huge into Gundam for a while. And so I was like, I wasn't really plugged into either of those things, but then, Cowboy Bebop was like, whoa, what this is the best. This is great.
Yeah.
And then I got into a few other series from there, before, falling back off the train, I guess.
So, and also one of the things that kind of surprised me as well about this, and it makes me wonder if there was any influence here at all, because a lot of Cowboy Bebop, when I eventually did see Firefly, because that's also something else I missed in its original run, and then I didn't get to it
Same.
until much later. And I think I may have seen Firefly before Cowboy Bebop, but when I watched Cowboy Bebop, I was like, oh, this seems very familiar to Firefly. And it does make me wonder if Josh Whedon was influenced at all by Cowboy Bebop, since this came out a few years before Firefly did.
I wouldn't be surprised. There's something evocative about the idea of a ragtag crew, of disparate backgrounds kind of being thrust together by circumstance and going on a series of adventures. And that is a common thread with both these series, and I think it's one of the things that resonates with fans of both shows, among other things about each of them. But I think we we all, as a general audience, enjoy watching shows where it feels like we see different aspects of the human experience and maybe our own personal experience reflected by these crews.
Yeah, and I think also too, like the influence, the whole idea of leaving Earth behind, and there's also the Chinese influence as well, which you see in the background a lot in Cowboy
Right.
Bebop too. Those parallels are there, even if and but one of the things I think too, and they also, the kind of like mix of, well, I think Cowboy Bebop does a little bit more genre mixing than Firefly did. Firefly is just basically sci-fi and western, whereas Cowboy Bebop throws a whole lot of other stuff in there too. There's an episode which is very evocative of horror. There's obviously heavy martial arts influence, and they seem to play around a little bit more with mixing genres throughout this entire series.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the advantages, certainly at the time when those shows were both coming out, of doing a series with animation, because especially a high concept sci-fi series, because you were just completely unrestricted. Of course, animation bears its own cost, but in terms of what you're able to visualize, how you're able to visualize it, you're just able to paint with a much broader on a much broader canvas with anime, because you're not limited by, well, we can't really do that in CGI yet, or we can't build the models to make that happen, or we don't have the budget in this season to do that in this episode. We have to be careful with our money. You're just completely unrestricted, so you can represent a whole range of stories and go to a whole range of places in animation that you just couldn't go to on an early 2000s Fox sci-fi show.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is one of the benefits of animation, which is why there is such a dearth of animation to begin with, because Japan doesn't have the Hollywood budgets, and they also don't have the location access. That like, one of the reasons why California was chosen as the site of Hollywood was, A, to get away from Thomas Edison, because he was strangling all the studio producers back then, but B, because you had every location you needed within driving distance. If you wanted to have scenes set in the snow, you just drive up a few hours north. If you wanted to have beach scenes, you drive a few hours south. And it was like the perfect place to have all these different locations. You have a lot more space to set up these sound stages, and Japan just physically does not have the same space. So a lot of the stuff that would be done in live action in the States is instead done as anime in Japan. Something like Cowboy Bebop, this probably would not have been done as animation in the States. This probably would have been a big budget sci-fi thing. Something like Paprika, last time we had you on to talk about that. That was something that would probably have been done in live action. It wouldn't have been done in animation. So there's a lot more focus on animation as a medium, just from a practical standpoint because it's cheaper than it is to do this stuff as movies. And if you've ever seen some of the live action sci-fi Japanese movies, they really do not have the budgets to really compete on that level.
Yeah, that's true. Even something as visually accomplished on a VFX angle as something like Godzilla Minus One, one of my favorite movies of last year. I still, as I'm sure most audiences did, if you're watching it, you still see some of the seams in terms of the VFX. But for me as a longtime fan of Godzilla movies, that's just part of Godzilla movies, right? Like nobody was really complaining about the fact that it was obviously a guy in a rubber suit crashing through cardboard cities. None of that looked really realistic. So how much am I going to ding this movie, which was shot on an incredibly lean budget, for accomplishing all this incredible VFX works? And so what if not, some of it isn't perfect? It doesn't have that massive Hollywood budget. None of these foreign, I say foreign, none of these films that are made outside of the United States do have the kinds of budgets that Hollywood films command.
Yeah. So let's talk about the movie. What are some of the things that really kind of jumped out to you in this movie?
It's been a while since I revisited the series itself, so I don't know if this is a fair comparison. This may not actually be true, but I do feel like the movie itself does feel, in addition to its length, it does feel like a bit of a bigger budget production. It feels like the production value is maybe a little bit higher, the scope's a little bit bigger. Uh, but the things that stand out to me about the movie are honestly the part of the reason why, as you said, it's such a good introduction to the series, the characters, the style, is because it has all of the elements that make the show so compelling. It's got the really awesome fluid action sequences, both the sequences in the ship, the spaceship, the plane, forget what it's named, and the martial arts sequences. You have an incredibly compelling victim, an incredibly compelling villain who, for those of you who are coming into the movie having seen the series, you know that Spike is like the badass to end all badasses. And so you're used to Spike, even when he's challenged, even when he has to figure his way out of a situation. He's you go into those confrontations feeling confident that he's gonna get the best of his opponent, and he gets his ass absolutely handed to him in this movie. He never really gets the best of his opponent, even at the end. It's a much less triumphant conclusion to a story like this than I think we as Western audiences are used to seeing. I think that's one of the things that was striking about the series as well as it came to a conclusion. It's this very bittersweet end to the story where we've come to love this crew and they all, for their own reasons, uh, split apart. And as you said, Spike has perhaps the most bittersweet ending. This protagonist of the series we've been following and loving and enjoying and rooting for seems like he meets his end. And even though he in some ways accomplishes his goals and finally reckons with his past, it is still a pretty downbeat ending for for the show. And so it is fitting that so many of those elements are used so well in this movie. And the music. I mean, the whole like the jazz set to these action sequence, like that was something that when I came to the series, I had never seen before. That was part of the reason why it was so compelling, is because it's so exciting and kinetic to watch.
No, I think that's all well said. And one of the things that I guess it's not really so much a knock on the series, but I guess one of the things I wish we could have seen more of is when you go into the series, you have several episodes, really, almost half the series, almost close to half the season, where the team, so to speak, is not even fully formed. And
Right.
so you do kind of that was one of the things that I liked about Firefly is you got the group pretty much already fully formed right from the jump. And although it is fascinating to see how they all come together, how they all end up eventually arriving on the Bebop, I do. One of the things that I love about the movie is we get to see them together much more than we ever really did in the series. Like even in when they after they were completely assembled, they're still going off on their own a lot on the series. And the scenes when we see them all together, I thought was really nice, and that was a benefit we got from this movie.
Yeah, for sure. And even though not all the characters are really well served by the movie, we still get for everyone a little bit more time with them. We flesh the characters out just a little bit more, which if you watch this movie of where it takes place chronologically in the series, when you are rewatching the series, it's kind of nice because it's this final adventure and moment for these characters to spend together before they start to go their separate ways as the series comes to an end.
And you mentioned the music too. I mean, the music in this is great. I mean, the opening credits of the TV show is one of my favorite opening credit sequence, you know, of all time. It's just
Hands down. Yeah.
yes, yeah, yeah. That the tank song and just like the style of it, it tells you everything you need to know about about the show in those opening credits. And this one, the opening credits, I mean, I don't think the visuals do the same thing as the TV show's opening credits do, but that song, Ass DNA, is amazing. I love that song. Anytime it comes on my playlist, I always crank it up.
Yeah. The music's on point. Again, it really does give you a sense of the aesthetics of the show and the kind of perspective of the series, the kinds of stories that it's going to tell, the tone that those stories are going to have, and the energy that the storytelling is going to have. And that begins with these credit sequences and with the music that starts right away on such a high note.
Now, when we talk about this movie, which version did you watch? Did you watch the version with the original Japanese audio, or did you watch the one with the English dub?
So I I'm trying to remember. I believe that the theatrical viewing that I saw most recently, I think that was the subbed version. But most often I have seen the dubbed version. That might have been the first time I've seen the subbed.
Okay. I was switching back and forth actually because I've seen both versions. I think originally the first time I saw it, it was the dub, and then later on I watched the subtitled version. And when I was watching this last night, I was kind of switching back and forth. I put on the dub for a little bit, and then I switched over, or I put on the subtitled version for a little bit, and then I switched over to the dub. And what do you think about because Japanese anime dubs are a mixed bag. Lately in the past 20 years or so, they've gotten a lot better. They've started to get, bigger name actors on it, more talented actors, but historically they have not been very good. What did you think about the dubbed version versus the original audio?
I found, especially in comparison to some of the anime series that I was also consuming at the same time as this, so uh, Hellsing, Noir, those series both had, to my ear, distractingly bad dubs. I never watched those shows dubs. I've only ever watched like 5 minutes of each of those series dubbed because it's bad. Cowboy Bebop and then later Samurai Champloo, I always found those to be well above average, certainly for their time, for dubbing of Japanese anime. So I've never really been, and because that's how I came to the series and to the movie, I've never really had a problem with the dub, even though generally speaking with anime, as I do with any film not in English, I prefer it in its native language.
Yeah, I tend to be in the same camp. I tend to prefer the original language as well, but just out of curiosity, I kept flipping back and forth because I wanted to have a better comparison. And I think Bo Billingsley is of the main cast. I think he's the only one that doesn't really sell me. He does the English voice of Jet. I feel like he's almost like cartoonishly gruff, where it doesn't quite work. It's not the same effect that Unsho Ishizuka, who voices him in the Japanese version, has. Steve Blum, I think, does a great job as Spike. Uh, it's probably like, and also Wendy Lee as Faye. I think she amazingly does a great job capturing Faye's voice and her character. And Wendy Lee is a name I've seen pop up a lot, so she's obviously very accomplished at this. Um, One other thing I noticed though that was interesting, and also the voice of Ed too, that is Melissa Fon.
Yeah.
She's also does an amazing job in the English dub. But one of the things that really fascinated me watching it, because so I watch these off my Plex server. I have the DVDs as backups, and when I had made the video file for this, I had burned in the English subtitles. So when I watched the movie last night and I was switching back and forth between the English dub and the Japanese version, the Japanese subtitles were still there. And one of the things that I found very interesting was the dialogue in the English version is slightly tweaked, and I think it actually rings better in the English dialogue compared to the subtitles. So that was another change I like, because that doesn't always happen. Sometimes when they play with the script a little bit, it can be very distractingly, different. I found that when I was watching the subtitles of Kiki's Delivery Service and the original um international version of that. Whereas this one, I thought they did an amazing job translating it and, changing some of the dialogue so that it better fits um a Western audience.
Yeah, I think they do a good job with the dub overall, and it is definitely it has always stood out to me as one of those series that the dubbing just didn't hit my ear as harshly as it seemed like almost every other series would.
Now let's talk a little bit about the story, and because this involves a former soldier who becomes a terrorist, and he's trying to release this nanomachine virus during a Halloween parade. And I think one of the things, if I'm going to criticize this movie for anything, it's the fact that it is pretty much just set on Mars. We don't get as much space action as we do in the series. But what are some of your thoughts about the story?
Yeah, the story is solid. I remember sitting down to watch it, and like I said, it had been probably 10 years since I watched the movie, and going, what was the plot of this? I didn't really remember, and I was a little worried that it wouldn't sustain the feature length, even though I had a recollection of never having that concern. I was like, man, I don't remember there being enough story in this to for it to be a feature length movie, and yet for me it didn't drag at all. It I think it moves very quickly. I think just like the show, there's such narrative momentum as well as visual momentum. And then, the show does have these moments where it allows the story to breathe, it allows the characters to breathe. I think one of the advantages of telling this story in a feature is that it does give you the opportunity to have those scenes of the characters just spending time with one another, being a team, reckoning with whatever's going on in their inner lives at this particular juncture in their journey together. And I really do like that. I think the stakes are good. I think the villain is compelling. I agree with you. I think if there was something to change, it would be nice to see, now that you have a feature film to play with, to hold a story. Would Could have been nice to have it have a little bit more of a grand scope, to have a story that takes place in multiple locations, multiple places, that spans this, vast space that we've seen these characters explore in other episodes. So yeah, I think that's fair, but overall I think it's a compelling plot. It didn't feel like what I think a movie like this could have felt like, which is it's just an episode stretched over a feature length runtime. I think that there are some movies based on TV series. I can think of a Star Trek movie off the top of my head that has received frequent criticism for being basically a feature-length episode of television and not really justifying its existence as a feature film in terms of the story that it wants to tell. But I think this story is a big enough story. It's a consequential enough. The stakes are consequential enough that I was invested in what was going on. And like you said, it does a good job of establishing these characters. It gets you rooting for them right away, and you're just on board with the story that they're trying to tell from the get-go.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think, talking about how the TV show mixed genres in different aspects, I feel like I don't know if they'd actually done this, but I do get the sense that when they went into making this, they kind of went in with the idea of, we're making a big budget action movie. It just happens to be set on Mars in the future, but it's not really science fiction in the way we think of, Star Trek or Star Wars or anything like that as science fiction. It's not really like space opera. It's more action. And in a lot of ways, it is actually kind of a grounded story when you think about it. Like, yeah, it is set in the future, but there's a lot of stuff in here that you could see happening. If you just made some tweaks here and there, you could actually set this story in the modern day.
Yeah, yeah. And again, like they do a good job of making the story that they do tell feel cinematic. Like the action sequences, of which there are quite a few, feel bigger, grander. The chase sequence. It goes on for quite a while. I mean, you're going like all over the area. I mean, it looks like a big budget, animation experience. It's just in terms of the narrative scope, it is a little narrowly targeted at just this planet, this place with these people here. And I get it because he is targeting this location for his terrorist attack, so that it makes sense for the story to take place here. But you can also imagine a way where they could have created a narrative where it maybe took a couple of steps for them to get to this location, where they all have their final confrontation. I don't know.
No, no, and also the I think when they had sat down to make this, they kind of figured, well, we kind of said everything we had to say about the characters themselves in the series, because, and this just feels like you had said, like one last ride before the tragic end of the series. And I guess in some ways we could see like the humbling of Spike in this movie when he gets defeated by Vincent could play a hand in his characterization in the final episode. But um excuse me. But also, one of the things that is interesting to me is talking about Vincent and his background. Like you said, he is a very compelling character. I think he is probably the most compelling character in the entire movie. He gets more development in this movie than I think, and even the principal cast members get.
Yeah, I think his story of being essentially experimented on to the point where he has no memories. He's essentially been driven insane, and he's not even really clear on whether or not he's experiencing reality or whether he's experiencing a dream, which is this really kind of profound existential crisis that he's going through. And it's this interesting science fiction philosophical premise where it's like, how do you know when you're awake, when you're dreaming, if your mind has been ravaged like this? To what extent we talked about this a little bit in our discussion of Paprika, when we see the lines getting blurred between dream and reality. Like it doesn't take, one can easily imagine that driving you mad, and this guy has been driven to the point where he's like nothing matters. Like even death doesn't matter. It's all just one dream that we're all going to experience. Like it's this very pretty dark, nihilistic end point that he's taken himself to, where he just feels like everything is pointless. We're just going to wipe everything out because nothing matters. We're all just dreaming, and death is nothing to worry about. So we might as well all experience it together. It's pretty dark, and it is one of those things where the series does this too, where you have a pretty light, effervescent style and some lighter episodes, and then you'll have an episode with subject matter that's dealing with like mass murder and nihilism and existential dread. And I think that's one of the things I really appreciate about the show and the movie.
Yeah. I want to talk more about Vincent and his background and some of the kind of the real world hysterical parallels to that, but we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back, and then we'll talk about those things.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. During tax season, your personal info travels to a lot of places, between payroll, your tax consultant, and the IRS. If your W-2 gets exposed, that's just the ticket for identity thieves. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it guaranteed or your money back. Don't let identity thieves take you for a ride. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
And we're back. And I'm looking over the Vincent's background, and I think one of the reasons why I think maybe Cowboy Bebop didn't strike it as hot in Japan as it did in America is because I think a lot of the references in it does seem very influenced by American culture, American movies, American music, or at least Western music, I guess is more accurate. Whereas something like Samurai Champloo was, obviously there's Western influences in there through the hip hop music, but it is much more Japan centric. And I think if I was going to strike on a reason why it didn't really hit as well in Japan, I think that is why, is that it is kind of an America centric show in a lot of ways, at least compared to a lot of other anime. And when I'm looking at Vincent's biography, I think that also carries over to the movie, because the fact that he was, he's drafted into the Mars Army when he's 20 years old. He's experimented on by the army. He is, he loses almost all his memories, except for the only thing he can remember is the fighting that he did in the war. And he has trouble distinguishing dreams from reality. I mean, all of this is, basically stuff you see in Vietnam veterans.
Yeah, the themes of a state organization just adding meat to the meat grinder through throwing people right into combat with little to no training, through subjecting them to, at least in a science fiction premise, like this, subjecting them to experimentation to try and create a better, more compliant, more murderous soldier. All of that feels like, oh, that echoes something from real world history that I can point to and say, oh yeah, that's not too much of an extrapolation from what they did here. Or you think about, like, not even Vietnam War, but like the MK Ultra tests by like the CIA, where we're just like, or the Tuskegee, experiments. Like we're just a state organization conducting clandestine medical experiments on the population just to see what happens, just to collect some data.
And there's also a parallel in Japanese history too, because many of the soldiers in the Imperial Army, right? Again, they were drafted just like in Vietnam,
Yeah.
and the
Oh
American
yeah, sure.
soldiers. They were forced into fighting, and they were also given a shitload of amphetamines to make them, more hyperactive, to stay awake longer, to fight better, and to be more aggressive. So there's also that aspect of it too, and the whole idea of Vincent coming out of that and being, I cannot tell I cannot escape the war. I can't escape this inhuman reality that I was forced to endure. I can't even dream anymore because it's so much a part of me that he's like, you know what, I'm just gonna end my life, but I'm gonna take everybody else with me as kind of like a as kind and it's not explicitly vengeance, but I think there is an aspect of that too.
Yeah, he's clearly like there's an aspect of him that is lashing out at the world that has created him. And he doesn't see a meaningful distinction between the specific people that were involved in what was done to him and people in general as a broad concept.
Yeah. And what do you think about the like one of the things where he says when he's taunting Spike and saying like, you're trying to be the hero, and where Spike is just like, oh, I'm just a bounty hunter and I don't really care what happens to the rest of the world. What do you think of that line? Do you think that was just kind of like Spike putting on airs? Do you think that's Spike, maybe he really believes that and he's lying to himself a little bit? What was kind of your idea about that?
Yeah, well, I think that does sort of flag where Spike is in his journey as a character at this stage in the story. And yeah, I think he is saying that, and maybe part of him thinks that is true, but we are beginning to see, and this movie is part of telling that story, as is the show in general, of actually there are things that Spike can be made to care about. He can care about what happens to his crewmates. He can care about what happens to all of these innocent people on the planet. Like, if there was no money on this guy's head and he found out what this guy was planning, like, I think, at the beginning of the movie, Spike is saying, Spike is essentially wanting to communicate that I'm just in it for the money. The only reason I'm here is because there's a bounty on your head. Whereas by the end, I think as an audience, we would believe that Spike would save the day regardless of whether or not there was a bounty on this guy's head, just because he knew what was at stake for everyone there and for the people that he cares about on this crew.
And that seems to be a recurring theme with Spike throughout the series and in this movie as well, is that he is because one of the interesting things about Cowboy Bebop and the whole crew is that they're this team of bounty hunters, but they're perpetually losing money. They're always poor. They're always, losing the bounty. They're always giving up the bounty, letting it get away or something
Right.
because out of a sense of a greater good. And when I look at Vincent, and this just struck me as I'm, kind of like having my screens open here, and you can see it on your screen too. I shared it, is that this image of Vincent, it looks very much like Spike. Like I
It
think
does.
there's a clear visual connection that they're trying to make. Like, if you cut his hair a little bit shorter and gave him a shave, he would be Spike, no question at all. I mean, it'd be very easy. In fact, I could probably just draw Spike's face right over this, trace right over it and draw Spike's face. So I think they're definitely trying to draw a clear line of comparison. Whereas, Spike was obviously a little bit different in that he was a criminal, but I guess that could also be a commentary too on the role of the military and in some of these places and some of these wars. I don't think we ever get quite an idea exactly of what this war on Titan was all about, whether the Mars army was, you know, what their role in it was, but I think uh there could be an argument made too for the military as a criminal organization in itself.
Yeah, and in confronting Vincent, Vincent holding up a mirror to Spike by acting the way he does, by saying, you know, by demonstrating this is how someone who actually doesn't believe in anything, who actually doesn't care about anyone, acts. And Spike is confronted with that for the very first time with someone who truly, truly represents the depths of the human soul that he pretends to, and realizes that no, that actually isn't me, and isn't who I want to be. And I think that does give him ultimately, like, when we shift back to the series, is part of what gives him the impetus that drives him towards his ultimate end.
And two, whereas there's also in that mirror image idea too, Vincent has no memory of Elektra anymore, right? His memory of her is completely gone. Meanwhile, Spike wishes he could forget Julia. Is kind of the implication I recall from. It's been a while since, forgive me if I'm overstating things. It's been a few years since I've watched the series all the way through, but I believe that was kind of the idea we're trying to get in this movie. Whereas he can't Vincent can't remember his past. Spike is trying to escape his past. I think there's something there to be said too.
Yeah, you have someone who is suppressing their own memories and someone who had them suppressed for him.
And he wants to get them back too, right? Spike wants to
Right.
forget, Vincent wants to
Yes.
remember. So there's that aspect of it
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
And it's funny because it drives them to different extremes. Whereas Spike gets to the situation where he's, a bounty hunter, he's working with a former cop, but he's trying to do the right thing now. Whereas he knows he was doing the wrong thing before. Whereas Vincent, again, we don't get much clue about the war itself, so we don't know what kind of actions he was involved in. But, if we're looking at, we can assume, like most people in the military, he thinks he's doing the right thing. He thinks even if he is drafted, he still believes that he's fighting for a just cause. You kind of have to do that in the military because otherwise, you're going to either, go MIA or, probably go crazy.
Right.
So we can assume
Another
that.
way that we drive our soldiers crazy is
Exactly.
by,
Yes.
in creating a system of, that is so oppressive that makes it so hard for your soldiers to believe that they're fighting for just cause. You're going to create much more insanity.
Yeah. And so, whereas maybe he thought he was doing the right thing and he wasn't, he ended up, losing everything. And now he's just like, fuck it. I'm gonna take everyone with me then. And he's completely been broken down by the experience. Um, and also there's this idea of the cozy relationship between the military and corporations, because you have the fact that this is a pharmaceutical corporation that wanted this study done in the first place, right? Elektra had worked for a colonel who was in charge of this pharmaceutical experiment. So there is that aspect of the military industrial complex that's also being criticized here.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there's definitely a layer of, as really there was in the series overall, of suspicion around institutions, especially governmental, established bureaucratic institutions. There's a lot of, the movie and the series are both very cynical about the people in positions of power.
Yeah, very much so. Um, those are kind of the main things that I wanted to touch on here. The only other thing I can think of is the action scenes and how those are rendered, because they did some amazing work on. And the action, I don't want to, understate what was done in the series, because the action in the series was very well done. But they were able, with the bigger budget they had, with the longer runtime, they were able to really do some new things that they weren't able to do in the series. And Watanabe, the creator, he said that he wanted to use more difficult technical techniques and to kind of create a live action look to this in some ways. And when you see especially that opening fight sequence in the store, that really comes across, I think.
Yeah, and a great way to, again, one of the things that makes this movie a really good introduction to Cowboy Bebop as a whole, as a concept, is that introduction to, this is what the fights in this show are like. They're really cool. There's a jazzy score. You're gonna love it. Spike kicks a lot of ass,
Mhm.
and is, you reveal that not only is he good in a fight, but that he's observant, intelligent, smart. Like, you reveal through action how capable this character is, and right away are dropped into what makes this show, this movie stylistically unique.
And also, this does have an interesting placement in history because this came out September 1st, 2001, which was, shortly before 9/11. And it didn't first come to the West until 2002, when it was showed at AnimeCon. Um, so I thought that was just very interesting timing, how we are right on the cusp of this massive global change that would happen with 9/11 and then leading into the war on terror. And then we get this film that feels almost like some of the themes would make more sense after 9/11.
Right. It was clearly conceived before 9/11, and the whole idea of like a mass casualty terrorist attack, of a weapon of mass destruction, that the sci-fi equivalent of biological weaponry. You've got this like nanovirus thing that's going to attack and kill this population. It is weird, the sort of shadow that 9/11, the war on terror, all of that did, the shadow that casts over this film and its themes and the story. We talk about the unfettered state and how it can abuse its power against its citizens, against its soldiers, and things only got worse after 9/11 here, like things didn't improve. Like the Patriot Act happened after, it never got repealed. Like some things got better, but a whole lot got worse and never went back. And this film's themes, its criticisms, even though they aren't too detailed or pointed, they're still very much there. They feel as relevant as ever.
Yeah, and speaking of 9/11, there was actually too, for people who don't remember, there was actually an episode of the TV show that was almost kind of like, it was almost a little bit sympathetic towards a terrorist, or at least, I'm not completely sympathetic, but shows it in a more sympathetic light, and that was pulled from U.S. broadcasts after 9/11.
I'd forgotten that. Which episode was that?
I want to say it was Sympathy for the Devil, but I can't
Oh,
recall
okay.
100%.
Yeah.
Are there any other things we wanted? I'm just double checking here. Are there any things that we wanted to say about Cowboy Bebop, the movie, or I prefer the title Knocking on Heaven's Door myself?
Yeah, it makes sense, especially with the theme. The Vincent keeps going on about purgatory and about death and about bringing about you know basically bringing all these innocent people right to heaven's door through his actions, as well as himself. So yeah, it's an appropriate subtitle and it's a good one.
Mhm. No, actually, so it looks like the Cowboy Funk was the episode that was pulled.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, I think that was all. Those are the things I wanted to say too. Um, so Ian, thanks so much for coming on again. Again, if you
Yeah,
have not
pleasure as
seen,
always.
yes, and if you have not seen this series before, if you're one of the few people in the West who's not seen this series, definitely go and check it out. And yeah, slot this in between episode 22 and 23. It's a great watch. Like I actually taught a class about Cowboy Bebop for about a year or so, and to Japanese students, and it was their first introduction to it, and it was a lot of fun going through and like finding all the the references to Western music and Western movies. There's a lot of stuff in there if you're a fan of Western music, if you're a fan of Western movies in general, that you will pick up on from the series. And even if you're not, it's just a great show to begin with.
Absolutely. Can I ask, what was the reception to it? You said that it wasn't really very popular. They hadn't seen it before, but once they did, how did they like it?
Oh, they loved it.
Great.
That's one of the things that surprised me. Like, this is something that anytime I've shown it to a student, they're just like, this is so good. How come we've never heard of this before?
Oh,
So it
that's
really
great.
is.
I mean, honestly, I take for granted, you take for granted. I think we both graduated from high school about the same time. How popular this show was, and maybe still is. Like, I don't know how much, even in the States, like how much the next generation of anime fans coming up know about Cowboy Bebop specifically. Whether it still has the same cultural legacy that it did for those, you know, 10 plus years for sure.
I mean, well, it was at least popular for Netflix to invest in a live action version, so there's that to
That's
say about
fair. That is fair.
it. So, I mean, it didn't get a second season, but that's,
No.
you know, unfortunately.
Yeah,
I actually I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it for what it was. I thought it was not the same as the series, but I kind of appreciated that for taking its own, kind of taking its same starting point and then just kind of going in its own direction.
sure, sure.
Okay, Ian, why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Yep, like I said up top, you can find me elsewhere on the Film Stories Podcast Network. We Are Starfleet is our Star Trek discussion podcast. We just had our most recent episode celebrating the 40-year, it hurts to say that, anniversary of Star Trek 3. And that's a really fun chat that Craig McKenzie, myself, Ashley Thomas, and Mike Slammer had. Those are the four co-hosts of We Are Starfleet. Also, very shortly to release a brand spanking new episode of Illumination Above All, our Severance discussion podcast. Now that the premiere of season 2 is in sight, we have a date, we have new footage, there is finally more to discuss, so we are back. So if you aren't already subscribed to Illumination Above All and you are a fan of Severance, please subscribe and engage with us online wherever you find us.
Okay, we'll have links to that stuff in the show notes, so please make sure to check that out. And as for us, japanonfilm.com is the website, and we are Japan on Film on Blue Sky, Threads, and Instagram. And we are also part of the Film Stories Podcast Network. Check them out, filmstories.co.uk. Listen up after the credits to hear what is coming up next on the network. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit japanonfilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on japanonfilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.